Thank you for coming along to this weekly football review following round 4 of the Telstra Premiership. Quite a few things out of the weekend, some video to show you, but more importantly a couple of announcements over the course of the weekend which are topical, which I'm sure you'll want to ask some questions about, but also I just thought it was worthwhile having a look at some statistics to start just briefly. Obviously there was a lot of talk about blowouts over the weekend and you know, I'll be honest up front, it wasn't a great round for us from that point of view. We saw a lot of lopsided scorelines across the course of the weekend, and this can happen from time to time. But let's have a look at some of those stats to start off with, just to give you an idea of what we did see over the weekend. So you can see here we've got the usual comparison of round 4 in the first column. That's the round we've just completed. This is the middle column is the season to date, so the first 4 rounds cumulatively, and the 2020 figures for the full year last year. So margins are up, of course, on round 4. As I said, we saw a number of games that blew out across the course of the weekend, from 15 points last year for the full season average up to 26 points in round 4, and you know, up a full 8 points or close to a full 8 points on the full year so far across all 4 rounds. The area of biggest concern, of course, was down here in the 19 plus points, bottom left-hand corner. 63% of games in round 4 had a margin of 19 or more points. And if you have a look at how that compared to last year, that was only at 28%, and year to date so far at 41%. So significant increase there with those high scores and those high margins. And of course we lost a fair proportion of our games in the 0 to 6 margin. So we had about a third of our games last year that were each week that fell into that 0 to 6 point margin, and 20% across the full year so far this year, but we didn't see any games in round 4 that fell into that 0 to 6 category. So not good, not what we would want to see. We pride ourselves on a tight competition and a close competition, but it is sport and there will be times where these things will happen. It's a long season and we generally found that they do tend to even out across the course of the season. And to demonstrate that, before I ask you if you've got any questions on it, I just wanted to show you this. These two tables, the left-hand side is 2020, right-hand side 2021. And what this is really showing us is, if I start from my left-hand side, your right-hand side, in 2021, where top 8 teams have been playing each other, this is top 8 teams based on where they finished last year, the margin is 8.3 points, where the same sort of clashes last year at this point was 11. So we've actually seen tighter and closer games where top 8 team is playing top 8 team so far this year compared to last year. In the middle, where you've got a top 8 team playing a bottom 8 team, it's very little movement. So average of around 20.9 as opposed to 19.6 last year. So it's only moved by just over a point in that category. Where the real movement has come so far is in this bottom 8 team playing bottom 8 team, which kind of is a bit counterintuitive. You'd think they'd be more equal, but that's not what we're seeing so far. So we've seen a significant rise this year in number of points per game in margin, or the margin in those games increase over last year. So, you know, I guess the reason I show you that is just to try and put it into some perspective, in that it is one weekend is a snapshot, and there's a lot of rounds of football to go, and I would expect that things would start to normalise a little bit as we get deeper into the competition. But you know, no hiding the fact that we had a significantly marginalised weekend of football in terms of the scorelines. Any questions on any of that? No? Okay, let's go to what's happened today and the announcement that the Australian Rugby League Commission has confirmed this morning and has approved, which is the introduction of the 18th player. So how will this work? You can see there that clubs can activate their 18th player in the following circumstances: when 3 players fail a head injury assessment. So that's the first way they can activate their 18th player, and that's in the course of any one match from the one team. When a player suffers a match-ending injury caused by foul play, and the offender is either sent to the sin bin or dismissed from the field. In that circumstance, a club has the option to activate their 18th player. To be eligible to be the 18th player, they must be an NRL registered player who's eligible for selection in that round and part of the 21-man squad that's selected each Tuesday. So today, teams will announce their 21 player squad for the coming round, and 24 hours out from the game, that would normally be reduced to 19, and it will continue to be reduced to 19, one of which will, of course, ultimately be the replacement player as opposed to the interchange player. And then 1 hour prior to kick-off, when teams submit their team list, they will nominate who is going to be their replacement player, as they do currently nominate their 4 interchange players. And that replacement player will sit on the bench with the interchange players, can't be used unless the 18th player is activated. The 18th player will wear a coloured vest that will differentiate between the 4 interchange players so that there's no confusion about interchange. Obviously, we have to make sure that there is, no contamination, for the want of a better word, of interchange players and replacement players unless that replacement player has officially been activated. And there's a process that will be provided to clubs in our operations manual that will dictate how that will happen. The club will have the option, if a player is fouled, and that doesn't have to be a head injury if it's foul play. So it can be any kind of injury sustained by a player that means that that player can no longer continue in the game. They will have the option of activating their 18th player. If there's no foul play that results in a sin bin or a send-off, then the only other way the 18th player can be activated is following losing 3 players to failed head injury assessments. And after that time, the club again has the option, they don't have to, but they have the option of activating their 18th player. In terms of the salary cap and how it'll be treated, a match fee will only be payable where the 18th player is activated. Obviously, the match fee is not included in the cap, and then any bonuses or ratchet clauses that are in players' contracts, if they're triggered, they will count in the salary cap. The 18th player will wear the vest, as I've mentioned, and it will commence from round 5 this coming weekend of matches starting on Thursday. So that has been signed off by the Commission overnight, announced this morning, and will be effective immediately. Happy to take any questions on that.
Graham, with the sin binnings and things like that, do you think it's going to put more pressure on referees to actually sin bin or send the player off?
I think referees are always under pressure to act consistently. Is there a chance that there'll be arguments about whether a player should have been sin binned or sent off, for that matter, and a team would then have the advantage of activating their 18th player, and in another similar situation the referee may not sin bin a player and therefore they don't have the option of activating their 18th player? Well, of course that can happen, but what I do know is that no 2 circumstances are exactly the same, and you can't have a blanket rule that says that every particular type of offence must automatically result in a sin bin or a send-off, because there are degrees of severity, there are degrees of or differences of circumstances that might lead to that so-called foul play. So yeah, I mean, there'll be a bit more pressure on referees, but they're already under that pressure. I mean, we saw a couple of weeks ago there was debate about whether a player should have been sin binned or whether he shouldn't. There's a bit more riding on that decision now, potentially, because you've got to remember that not only is it foul play, but the player who suffers the foul play or is on the receiving end, they have to be in a position where they don't return to the game. So, quite often if there is a high tackle or whatever it might be, a player might go off, they might be assessed and they might come back on later in the game. So there's a few things that have to fall into place before it would actually give the club the option to activate an 18th player, but it's in those circumstances either 3 head injury assessments failed, or losing a player for the rest of the game as a direct result of foul play and the player being sent to the sin bin or being sent off.
There was discussion that it was going to be an emerging player. What's the reasoning behind making it a player who's in that top squad?
The logic behind that is that the Commission wisely asked after the Commission meeting last week for us to conduct a consultation process with the clubs, which we did over 48 hours. We organised Zoom calls with every one of our clubs, and on each of those calls we had the football manager and in many cases the head coach. We consulted with the Rugby League Players Association. We had a Zoom call with them, and we took all of their feedback. We asked them what they thought about the proposed change. We got the feedback. We recorded that in a spreadsheet. We drew some conclusions based on the majority opinion in each instance or each aspect, and we fed that information back to the Commission over the course of the weekend so that they were armed with the information to make the final decision overnight. So a lot of the feedback was that the clubs thought that that was too restrictive. There was also a view that perhaps some of the development players may not be up to it if at that stage of their career, and they just felt that if they were to take advantage of this situation, should the circumstances present themselves, that it should be a player who's trained with the squad, who knows the other players, who can easily step in, who won't be placing themselves at any disadvantage or risk of injury because of their use or inexperience.
And it seems like there have been a couple of tweaks since the last week. Do you feel you've got the right combination for the rule?
Yeah, well, for us it was a data collection process really. It was about contacting the clubs. Of course, we have our own views which we fed into the process as well, but we had to get all of that information, be it our own views internally, be it the views of the clubs, the players, the football managers, the RLPA, and we had to present all that information back to the Commission. So the Commission are the only ones that can change rules, and they wanted to have the feedback from the stakeholders before they made the decision. So our job was to collate that, to present it, and to allow the Commission to make their decision, and the decision has been made overnight.
Are you comfortable that there's enough guidelines around this that are going to prevent coaches from possibly exploiting it?
Yeah, I am. I think the fact that it requires 3 HIAs is a big factor in that. It's not going to be easy for clubs to find themselves, and let's be frank, we don't want clubs to find themselves in the position where they've lost 3 players to head injuries. But if they do find themselves in that unfortunate position, they have to have been very unlucky in the course of one game. We don't see it very often where one team will lose 3 players to a head injury during the course of a match. But if they do get to that point, then the view of the Commission was that clubs shouldn't be unduly disadvantaged by that, because we do encourage clubs now to be very responsible and very conservative about taking players off the field when they've suffered a head knock. That's a duty of care that we all carry, clubs, administrators, everyone associated with the game. So in encouraging clubs to make sure that they don't take any risks with players, they can often place themselves at a disadvantage, and we don't feel that that should happen if they've been unlucky enough to find themselves in that position. So I think that with the circumstances as they are, it's not going to be happening in every game every week. It's going to be happening in reasonably rare circumstances. And remember, there are 4 players on the bench, so as players get injured, the clubs do have interchanges, and they can cover, in most cases, for players that they lose. And they're not only losing players to head injuries, they're losing players to all sorts of other injuries as well. And at times they can find their bench depleted to 1 or 2 players. But that's the nature of the game. That's the way the game's always been conducted. Even before we had interchanges, we had replacement players where you couldn't there was no such thing as interchanging players. You used to go on and replace someone, and that person that you replaced was out of the game for the rest of the game. But you would often find clubs finishing games with 12 or 11 players. But we don't want that to happen. We want the contest to be even, and we want to, as much as possible, protect the integrity of the game, the health and safety of the players, and also give the fans something that they can see as a contest with 13 on 13 as much as possible.
Graham, we're seeing this come in at round 5. Is that because of this sort of increase in the amount of injuries that we're seeing? Is this in response to that, or is this something that's been talked about in the background?
It's been considered in the past. There was discussion in the old competition committee 2 seasons ago about this very 18th man rule. And it went to the commission at that point, and it was decided not to implement it at that time for a variety of reasons. But what we have seen, I think, over the ensuing period since that decision is that there is a far greater focus and emphasis on head injuries and minimising the potential for consequences from head injuries. So, as I said a moment ago, we encourage teams to take a very conservative approach with getting players who have suffered a head knock off the field. And the Commission felt, and rightly so, that this was a natural next step to try and ensure that clubs continue to take that duty seriously, which they all do, but also to try and make sure that clubs and fans in particular aren't disadvantaged by seeing teams depleted to the point where they're playing with less than their full complement of players on the field.
Do you have the numbers for how many times this could come into effect for the foul play side of it this year?
For foul play, well, we've seen, no, I don't have them off the top of my head, but I mean, we don't see many send-offs, as most people would be aware. I think last year there might have been maybe 2 send-offs in the course of the season. So the sin bin is the most likely outcome for minor foul play. We also don't see the major incidents of deliberate foul play that perhaps the game saw in eras gone by. So most incidents of foul play, as we call it, foul play under the rules, is in many cases a result of misjudgment or bad timing, often even almost accidents. I mean, there can be careless and reckless acts, so, players may not exercise the necessary duty of care, and and that's a factor with the judiciary, and it's also a factor with the match review committee. But the number of times that we see players go to the sin bin, I don't have those figures at hand, but it's not only players going to the sin bin, it's also players going to the sin bin where the player who's been fouled can't continue. So that reduces the numbers again severely. There's any number of cases where a player will receive some sort of foul play during the course of a match, and they will either not leave the field, or they'll leave the field temporarily and they'll come back. So this rule doesn't apply in those circumstances. It only applies in the circumstances where there is an act of foul play. The player who has been on the receiving end of that can't continue in the game, and the player who committed the act has either been sent to the sin bin or sent off.
Just a couple of hypotheticals for you, Graham. Yeah, first one is like, for the third HIA, if it's 10 minutes to go, I mean, what's the time frame between being able to rule a player out?
Yeah.
Like, do they have to wait a certain period?
Yeah.
Normal circumstances for a normal HIA, currently, a player who is taken off for an assessment, a head injury assessment, there is a 15-minute period during which time the medical staff have the chance to assess that player properly to determine whether they can return to the game or not. And of course, if they return to the game, it's a free interchange. After 15 minutes, it counts as an interchange. In this scenario, if you get to your third HIA and you would like to, or you're in a position where you can still activate your 18th man, there will have to be a medical assessment made by the club medical officer, the club doctor, about whether that player can in fact will be able to return to the field, or whether they'll be out for the rest of the game. Now, in that scenario, because there is a further consequence obviously from your third HIA that there isn't from either your first or second HIA, the club medical officer can make that decision as he sees fit. So he may know immediately upon examining the players that the player's in no condition to return. And yes, we could be in the last, for example, last 10 minutes of the game. That's definitely possible, or the last 15 minutes of the game. So at that point, if the club medical officer deems that the player cannot return to the field of play, the club medical officer will have to advise the NRL staff on duty at the game that the player won't be returning and they would like to activate their 18th player, and that will be allowed to take place, provided that the club still has interchanges left, right? Because that's another factor. I mean, you still only get 8 interchanges. So if, depending on what point we are in the game, if they've used all their interchanges, well, it might be that bringing your 18th player in is superfluous because you've got no interchanges left. So there are a number of factors that will determine, if a club wishes to introduce their 18th player, and there'll be a number of rules around in what circumstances they can do that.
So it's not a free interchange, like it's not a free HIA interchange.
It's not an additional interchange, no.
And just another one around, did I have in my notes?
That's all right.
Sorry, foul play with, yeah, I don't know. I'll bring it up again.
At the end we can, if there's no more questions on that, I can move on to some of the video out of the weekend. Yep, got it.
Going back in play, like how far back can we go back and have a look at something if it's foul play, if it wasn't missed originally, or?
For a player to be either sin binned or sent off, it will have to be obviously at the time of the incident. The bunker has the ability to look at foul play in that incident. So the referee would have to obviously rule on the act of foul play, would have to determine that the player was required to go to the sin bin or be sent off, and the player who has been fouled would have to leave the field. Once that player goes off, it's a bit different to a HIA, unless the foul play results in a HIA or a head injury. But if it's let's say it's a rib injury or something like that, then they can, again, they just have the option in that situation to activate their 18th player. They don't have to, and as long as that player, if he goes off, whether it be with the rib injury or any other type of injury, leg injury, there's no time limit on them to make that assessment, but the player who goes off cannot return if they activate the 18th player. So they have to make that assessment. Sometimes they might take the player off, they might work on him for a period of time to determine whether he can come back or not. And if he comes back, of course, they don't get to use the 18th player. But if they say he can't come back, then they've got the option in that situation, which is very separate to the HIAs. Mm-hmm.
With the addition of this foul play clause, I guess, was that part of the feedback that you got from clubs and players over this past week?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there was a what we sent back to the commission was obviously a summary of everything that was raised, club by club. So we listed all of the clubs. We framed a number of questions so that we were asking every club the same sort of questions, and we recorded their responses to each of those questions, put it all in a spreadsheet. So what the commission had available to them was the views of every club across, I think there was 5 different questions that we asked, all about the different aspects of what was proposed. And so clubs, common themes did come out of that, and those common themes are the sorts of things that have been approved as amendments by the commission. Okay? All right. Nothing more on that. We can come back to it if you want at the end of this, but let's just move on to some footage. A couple of things out of the Sunday afternoon match that I just wanted to show you. There was a bit of controversy around some passes, in fact, in the Knights and Dragons game. So let's just let's go to the Mitchell Barnett forward pass to Hymel Hunt. So what we've done here is we have split the screen into three, and I just want to, I'll play this, and the two quadrants, or the 2/3 here that I'm really interested in, are the top right and the bottom left. So I'll just play it initially. Now there was a bit of debate about whether this was in fact a forward pass or not. But let's just go back and have a look at a few factors here. Firstly, if you look at the bottom left, just have a look at firstly the positioning of the touch judge here. So the touch judge has actually stopped. So he's looking with his gaze set at this particular pass, both the passer and the receiver. So now that's fact one that I want you to have a look at. If you have a look at the top right, as we go through it, just have a look at where the ball leaves the hands there. And I know there's some debate about whether the hands go forward or not. And I seem to spend a lot of time at these briefings talking about forward passes and whether they are in fact forward or not. And many times I've said that camera angles can be extremely deceiving. And this just kind of further reinforces that angles can be deceiving. But if you have a look at Barnett's foot there, he's at the very end of that, at that hash mark that intersects the 10-metre line. And then as he releases the ball and Hunt receives the ball, he's literally almost on the 10-metre line. So I don't think, based on the footage that we have, and the positioning of the touch judge, that we have any reason to believe anything other than the correct decision was made. And I'm the first to put my hand up when I think that there's been an error made, but just based on as much examination as we can put on the evidence that we have available, then I think that you would have to say that the person who was best placed to make this decision is the touch judge, who's literally 1 metre, or a few metres from the passer and 1 metre from the receiver. Again, top left shows you exactly where the touch judge is in comparison to the two players. So there was that one. In the same game, I just wanted to show you now this one, it did again create some controversy, and no one really picked this up initially live, so we'll just let it run through first. And you'll see there's a pass here, cut out pass, ball goes to Lomax, and ultimately across for a try in the corner. Now, the bunker, under our new system this year, the bunker reviews all tries when they're awarded by the referee. They review it in the background. And there was no real question mark on this try during the live play. But when you go back, and this is what the bunker has the responsibility to do, and I know that there'll be mixed views about whether we should be looking at things this closely or not, but if the bunker didn't act on this and it was picked up later, either by the media or by the club in their own review of the match, then I'd be standing up here explaining why the bunker and the referee missed this. But you'll see as the ball goes across and Duffy passes the ball, you've got a finger there. He tries a cut-out pass. So it's Josh Kerr who has the ball brush his thumb as he tries to initially take it and decides to withdraw, and it goes to Lomax. Now, there's no way that can be anything other than a knock-on. He's propelled the ball forward off his hand, off his fingers, and it's just the momentum of the ball's kept it going sideways, of course, and it's gone over to Lomax, and he gives the final pass for the try to be scored. But again, this is these things in the sort of television coverage that we have of games these days. These are the things that can be picked up, and this is why we changed the bunker system this year, so that we weren't necessarily asking referees to stop incidents or stop the play for incidents like that where the referee may have been unsure about whether there was any contact by the player who was cut out by the pass. So the referee awards the try, and rather than hold the whole game up and have everyone waiting for a response, the bunker reviews it in the background. In this case, they saw the hand hit the ball and they correctly disallowed the try. We would have all loved to have seen the try scored because it was obviously the result of some very good football. But if it's not affected properly and there's an error, then the bunker's got a responsibility and the referee has a responsibility to act upon it. The next one I wanted to go to was another one. This is a bit almost an optical illusion. This happened yesterday in the Tigers versus the Eels game, and there was a suggestion that Gutherson here was offside. But if you have a look at the play in normal speed, firstly, you can see why there was that suggestion that he was in front of Ferguson when he kicked the ball. But again, if you go back and look at it sorry, bear with me. Technology breakdown. There we go. So we'll just go back and have a look at the point where Ferguson reaches out for the ball. The ball's bouncing and he has to throw his body forward to actually make contact with it. And if we look at the point where he strikes the ball, and again, I think that on the basis of the evidence that we've got available, there's nothing to suggest that Gutherson is in front of him. It's not. I'd suggest looking at that again, being aware that camera angles can lie, but looking at that, it looks like Gutherson is behind that ball when the foot makes contact with it. And it looks a bit funny because it just kind of appears in open space and lobs straight into his hands. But our review of that is that that's perfectly legitimate. The next two I just wanted to show to finish off before I go to any other questions about these or any other incidents from the game, was there was a bit of confusion and a bit of comment across the course of the weekend about obstruction and how it's dealt with on the field. I want to show two incidents. The first one is one involving James Tedesco, where he runs behind his own players, and the other one that I'll show you involves Mitchell Moses running behind his players. And we get two different answers in these cases, and I just wanted to try and point out that, again, you can't put a blanket hard and fast rule on how situations like this are dealt with. You have to allow the officials some discretion because otherwise we would have to have a blanket rule that says anytime a ball carrier runs behind one of his own players, it's a penalty. And we would see ridiculous situations where there's no defenders anywhere near the ball carrier, but because he runs behind one of his own players, we have to award a penalty. But there are circumstances where a player runs behind his own player and it does impact the defensive line and it will result in a penalty. So here's two examples of incidents that either resulted in penalties or didn't. And let's look at the Tedesco one first. And you'll see he will double back and he's about to run past his own player over here, puts his hands up. He sort of jinks to go to the right of him and then steps off his right foot and doubles back. And you can see the Warriors defender directly in front of him here is forced to kind of drop off and duck around. He actually puts a hand on the player who's in front of Tedesco and he has to duck around him. So it's changed the motion of the defensive line by running behind his own player. So in this case, I think it's perfectly legitimate for the conclusion to be drawn that that's an obstruction. There'll be people who will disagree, and I accept that, but I think that the Warriors defenders here had to think about that player who stopped in the defensive line, he's stationary, puts his hands up, which doesn't relieve him of his obligations, and forces the defence to check and turn around to push off that player to try and follow the play. Now, there'll be people who'll say that he would never have got to wherever he was going anyway, and maybe that's the case, but the fact is he didn't have the opportunity, or he had his opportunity hindered to be able to do that. So we go from that to the Mitchell Moses incident, and I'll put a little rider on this one because there's a couple of times here where Mitchell Moses runs behind his own players, and I think the There is a bit of a question mark on the first time that he does it, but there's other occasions which probably drew more criticism that I think are perfectly legitimate. So let's have a look at this firstly. So there he is with the ball there. Now this is the point where I think there may be some question mark. You see Gutherson goes through and he stops and Moses pushes off and Gutherson is in the line there. So I think there's a bit of a question mark on that, but then Moses continues across field, jinks again, turns around, swivels, runs behind a player there, but there's no attempt by that defender to get to him in that position. And ultimately kicks the ball, it's gathered and a try scored. So I wanted to show those two examples just purely to demonstrate that there'll people say, oh, well, he ran behind his own players, didn't get penalised. Tedesco ran behind his player, got penalised. And I'm just trying to clarify that the circumstances can be different, which leads to a different outcome. And I know there's a tendency at times for people to say, well, it's the same, but it's not the same. The circumstances are always slightly different. And the referees have to adjudicate on that. They have to use their discretion. And the great thing about our game is that there'll be people who will either agree or disagree with both of those examples. But at the end of the day, we have to make a determination about whether the decisions were right or wrong. And that's how we see them in here. That's all I had in terms of videotape, and the other issues, the stats from the weekend, the blowouts, score lines, and the 18th player. Happy to take any questions on any of that or anything else that you wanted to ask about from the weekend.
Graham, there's a lot of sort of talk about the under-20s, and obviously, that got suspended in 2017. Is that something that you feel like could assist with this big margin and sort of allowing development players to sort of come through easier for a multitude of clubs?
Not having the under-20s competition anymore? Is that what you said? Look, it's hard to know, to be honest. I mean, we've got very, very strong state-based competitions where all of our clubs feed their players to get competition at probably the toughest level below NRL. In both the Queensland state competition and the New South Wales competition, there are a lot of very experienced players who play the game as hard and as tough as they can, many of them former NRL players themselves. So there's no lack of opportunity for clubs to develop their players, give them the sort of competition that they need to be ready to step into the NRL as and when they're required. The facts are with the under-20s competition that very few players in the under-20s competition went on to have successful careers in the NRL. There were some, of course, but in terms of the overall numbers, most of them didn't. So it's very, very hard. I'm not saying that it has no impact, but it would be different if we had no under-20s and nothing else. But what the clubs are concerned about is getting their players, their fringe players, as much game time as possible in the strongest possible competition. And of course, in an under-20s competition, many of those players who are older than 20 couldn't play in that competition anyway. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's one of those things that will be debated and argued about whether it has made any difference or not since it's been disbanded. But hard for me to give you an answer that's accurate because I don't think anyone knows.
There's been a lot of talk that maybe the rule changes have made the game too fast and they're the reason why there's been so many blowouts. Do you believe that that's the case?
Well, the statistics are telling us that's not the case. The stats, which I haven't shown today, because I only take a sample of things to provide each week, but the overall statistics in terms of the time that the ball's in play, the number of errors in the game, the number of penalties in the game, the elapsed time that it takes to play games, all of the standard indicators that we use to measure the speed of the game, which includes the distances that players are running using GPS data and so forth. It's not demonstrating a significant difference on last year. It can be a variety of reasons. I mean, the weekend that we've just had, for example, was just through a quirk in the draw. We had a lot of teams that have been performing well playing teams that haven't been performing that well. So we had a weekend where, you might get 1 or 2 of those sorts of games across the course of a weekend normally, but we had, a whole bunch of those games this weekend. So there are too many factors, I think, to draw any conclusions. What we have to do is we have to monitor the whole season, and we have to, get enough data to be able to draw some really valid conclusions. Are we happy about the score lines over the weekend? We're not, but it is sport, and it's a sport that is played on its merits. No one interferes with how the players play the game, as long as they're abiding by the rules. They're left to their own devices to determine the outcome of matches, and the coaches prepare them differently, and there are so many factors that play into it. What's their turnaround time from their last game? Have they been in form? Have they been out of form? How have they got sickness in the club? You just don't know. There are so many factors that will dictate what happens on any given week in any game. So it's very, very difficult to draw any conclusions at this stage. But to answer your question again, the statistics are not showing that the game is so much faster this year than it has been in the past.
You said that you'd like a bigger sample size, I guess. How much of a sample size do you think it would take to have a fair indication of, whether there are bigger blowouts, or what do you think a fair sample size would be?
By the time we get to about halfway through the season, you start to see some trends kind of, once you get beyond halfway through the season, the trends kind of don't change much. So, if they're showing something, it will continue, generally speaking, to trend in the same direction. Can change a little bit, but overall, it doesn't. It wouldn't change much from there. But even at that point, it's not necessarily going to point to one reason. It's not going to. The stats are not necessarily going to say to us, well, it's the rule changes or it's anything else. What they will provide us with is data where we can try and hypothesise about what some of those reasons might be, and do it in an educated way based on an examination of the data. But it's not necessarily going to give you a specific reason why scorelines are as they are, why ball in play may be up or down, why players' errors may be up or down, why we're getting more or less injuries. But we need to have a reasonable sample to be able to even try and make some of those assessments.